The poker chip clattered across the rough-hewn table like a death sentence. 5 men sat frozen in the back room of Sullivan's saloon, smoke hanging thick as gilt in the lamplight. Outside, Deadwood sprawled in its usual chaos of mud and sin. But in this room, time had stopped. The pot sat in the center. $347 in gold coins, 2 land deeds, a ruby brooch, and a signed contract that made Margaret Rose Thornton the property of whoever won this hand. Jacob Mercer stared at his cards, his jaw working beneath his dark beard. Across from him, Samuel Thornton, Margaret's own father, wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. His hands trembled as he laid down 3 queens, a losing hand. The hand that had just sold his daughter to settle a debt. "Well," Jacob said quietly, his voice like gravel underfoot, "seems the lady's mine." The other men scraped their chairs back, suddenly eager to be anywhere else. Samuel stayed seated, his face gray as ash. And upstairs, through the thin walls, they could hear her, Margaret, singing softly to herself, unaware that her life had just been wagered and lost. But Margaret Rose Thornton knew something none of these men did, something that would make Jacob Mercer question everything he thought he'd won. But before this moment shattered their world, let me take you back to where it all began. 3 weeks earlier, Margaret stood in the morning light of her father's failing homestead, hanging laundry with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd learned to make do with nothing. She was 23, and the frontier had aged her in ways that didn't show on her face. Her hands were strong from work. Her eyes were clear and watchful. She hummed while she worked, old hymns her mother had taught her before the consumption took her 5 years back. The Thornton place sat 12 miles outside Deadwood, where the Black Hills rolled like frozen waves. It had been a good claim once. Samuel had been a good man once. But grief and whiskey had a way of rotting a man from the inside out, and the claim showed it. Fences fallen, fields lying fallow, the barn listing to one side like a drunk. Margaret pinned the last sheet and turned to see a rider coming up the long approach. She knew him immediately by the way he sat his horse, straight-backed, deliberate, a man who'd never hurried a day in his life. Jacob Mercer. "Miss Thornton," he said, touching his hat brim as he reined in. "Mr. Mercer." She didn't curtsy, didn't smile. Frontier women learned early that politeness could be misunderstood for invitation. "Your father home?" "He's in town," which they both knew meant he was at Sullivan's, drinking away what little they had left. Jacob nodded slowly, his dark eyes taking in the failing homestead, the lone woman keeping it barely alive. "I'll catch him there, then. You take care, Miss Thornton." He rode off, and Margaret watched him go with a feeling she couldn't name, something between dread and curiosity. Jacob Mercer didn't ride 12 miles to chat. He wanted something. And on the frontier, when a man with money wanted something, someone always paid the price. Over the next 2 weeks, her father changed. Samuel started disappearing for longer stretches, 2 days, 3 days, coming home with money in his pockets but fear in his eyes. He'd mutter to himself while he worked, start sentences he couldn't finish. When Margaret asked him where he'd been, he'd wave him off with shaking hands. "Business in town," he'd say, "just business." But his business smelled like whiskey and desperation. Margaret noticed other things, too. The way he'd look at her across the dinner table with something like grief, like he was memorizing her face. The way he'd started settling old debts, paid the mercantile account, settled with the blacksmith, even returned money he'd borrowed from their nearest neighbor, the widow Patterson. "Papa," Margaret said one evening, watching him count coins at the kitchen table, "what's going on?" "Nothing you need to worry about." "I'm not a child. If we're in trouble—" "Eve said it's handled." His voice cracked. He pushed away from the table and grabbed his coat. "I'm going to town." He was gone 4 days that time. When he came back, Jacob Mercer was with him. They rode up together in the late afternoon, Samuel slumped in his saddle like a man riding to his own hanging. Jacob looked the same as always, unreadable, composed, patient as stone. "Margaret," her father called, his voice thin, "come out here, please." She stepped onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands. The sun was behind them, putting both men in silhouette, and something about the scene made her heart kick hard against her ribs. "Mr. Mercer's made a generous offer," Samuel said, not looking at her. "He's willing to buy the claim, pay off all our debts, and give us enough to start fresh somewhere else." Margaret looked between them. His hands were shaking. Jacob sat perfectly still. "That is generous," she said carefully. "What does he want in return?" Samuel opened his mouth, closed it, couldn't find the words. Jacob spoke instead, his voice quiet and even. "Just the land, Miss Thornton, just the land." But the way he looked at her, steady, measuring, like a man appraising something valuable, told her that wasn't the whole truth. That night she heard her father weeping in his room, and she knew with cold certainty that whatever debt he'd gotten himself into, it was the kind that couldn't be paid with land alone.
The truth came out the way truth always does on the frontier. Whispered, second-hand, impossible to unhear. Margaret was in town buying flour when she heard it. 2 women at the mercantile, talking in voices they thought were low enough. Poker game at Sullivan's. His own daughter, can you imagine? Jacob Mercer won her fair and square, they say. Margaret's hands went numb. The flour sack slipped through her fingers and hit the floor with a soft thump that seemed loud as a gunshot. She didn't remember leaving the mercantile. Didn't remember the ride home, but she remembered standing in the doorway of their cabin, looking at her father slumped at the table with an empty bottle beside him and asking in a voice that didn't sound like hers, "Did you gamble me away?" Samuel's face crumpled. "Margaret, did you? I thought I could win. I thought—" He covered his face with his hands. "I owed them so much money. Mercer said he'd cancel all of it if I played one hand, just one hand, and I had a good draw. I had queens." "You sold me." The words came out flat, dead. "You sold me in a poker game." "It's not like that. Mercer's a decent man. He'll treat you well. You'll have a good life, better than I could ever." "A good life?" Her laugh was sharp enough to cut. "As property? As something won?" "Margaret, please." But she was already walking out, her mind spinning, her whole world tilting sideways. She rode to town, found Sullivan's saloon, pushed through the doors into the smoke and noise, and every man there turned to look at her. The woman who'd been gambled and lost, standing in a room full of men who'd heard the story. "Where is he?" she asked the bartender. "Upstairs, last door on the left." She climbed the stairs with her heart pounding, knocked once on Jacob Mercer's door and walked in without waiting for an answer. He was sitting by the window, reading the newspaper, still dressed despite the late hour. He looked up without surprise, like he'd been expecting her. "Miss Thornton, I want to know exactly what you think you've won, because I'm not a deed to be signed or property to be claimed. I'm a human being." Jacob set down his paper slowly, stood, looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "I know that. Your father doesn't, but I do." "Then why?" Her voice cracked. "Why would you do this?" He was silent for a long moment. Then, Because I've watched you keep that homestead alive for 5 years while your father drank himself into debt. I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion for a man who didn't deserve your loyalty. And I knew, he paused, I knew if I didn't do something, you'd die out there trying to save him. Margaret stared at him, her certainty wavering. You don't even know me. I know enough. He took a step closer. I know you're the strongest person in Deadwood. I know you deserve better than what you've got. And I know, he chided his jaw, I know I'm not a good man, Miss Thornton, but I'm a better bet than where you were headed. She wanted to slap him. She wanted to walk out. She wanted to scream that this wasn't salvation, it was theft dressed up as rescue. But somewhere deep down, a traitorous part of her wondered if he might be right. You think you're rescuing me? Her voice rose, all the fear and rage of the past weeks boiling over. You think buying me makes you my savior? I didn't buy you. Yes, you did. She stepped closer, trembling with fury. My father put me in a pot like a piece of jewelry, and you took me. That's what happened. Don't dress it up. Jacob's composure finally cracked. Your father was going to lose you anyway. There were 4 other men at that table, and I promise you, not one of them would have treated you half as well. So I should be grateful? She laughed bitterly. I should thank you for being the best of a bad lot? I'm trying to, what, save me? She was close enough now to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, the tension in his jaw. I don't need saving, Mr. Mercer. I needed my father not to be a drunk and a coward. I needed to not live in a world where women can be wagered like cattle. But here we are. Here we are, he agreed quietly. The fight seemed to drain out of him. He sat down heavily in the chair by the window. You're right, about all of it. I told myself I was helping, that I was giving you a way out. Maybe I just wanted something I couldn't have any other way. The admission hung in the air between them. What do you want from me? Margaret asked, her voice breaking. Jacob looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something raw and unguided in his face. I want you to have a choice. That's what I want. So here it is. I'll tear up the contract, give you money to start somewhere new, California, Oregon, wherever you want to go, or you can stay, not as property, as my wife, if you have me. A real marriage, legal and proper. You'd have half of everything I owned, you'd have your own name, your own rights, and if you ever wanted to leave, you could. Margaret stared at him, her mind reeling. Why would you do that? Because I've spent 3 years watching you from across town. Because you're the only person in Deadwood who's not afraid of hard work or hard truth. And because, he stood slowly, because I'd rather have you hate me as my wife than wonder for the rest of my life what might have happened if I'd asked you honestly. Outside, Deadwood sang its nightly chorus of piano music and drunken laughter. Inside, Margaret Rose Thornton stood at the crossroads of her life, looking at a man who'd bought her and was now offering to set her free. I need time, she whispered. Take all you need. I'll be here.
Margaret stayed in town that night, sleeping in a room Jacob paid for at his hotel. She didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought about her mother, who died urging her to be brave, about her father, who'd betrayed her out of weakness, about Jacob Mercer, who'd won her and then offered her freedom. In the morning, she went back to the homestead. Samuel was on the porch, sober for once, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. "I'm sorry," he said before she could speak. "God help me, Margaret, I'm sorry. I thought I was clever enough to win. I thought I could fix everything. But I've never been able to fix anything, not since your mother died." Margaret sat down beside him on the steps. The morning sun turned the Black Hills gold. "Why didn't you tell me," she asked quietly, "about the debt, about how bad things were?" Pride? His voice was hoarse. Shame? Take your pick. You were already carrying so much. I couldn't admit I'd failed you the way I failed her. And there it was, the truth that had been rotten at the center of everything. Her father hadn't gambled her away out of cruelty. He'd done it out of desperation, out of the terrible, broken love of a man who'd lost his way 5 years ago and never found his way back. "Mama's death wasn't your fault," Margaret said, surprising herself. "I couldn't save her. No one could have saved her, but you could have let me help save us." Samuel looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "What are you going to do?" Margaret stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "I'm going to make a choice. For myself. For the first time in my life, I'm going to choose." She rode back to town in the afternoon light, her decision made. Jacob was in his office above the mercantile, working through ledgers with the same methodical care he seemed to apply to everything. "I'll marry you," Margaret said from the doorway. "You will?" He looked up, careful hope in his eyes. "On 3 conditions." She stepped into the room. "1, we tell everyone the truth. No lies about how we met, no pretending this was a normal courtship. I won't start a marriage with a pretty fiction." "Agreed." 2, I want half of everything put in my name, legal and binding. And I want my father's debts forgiven, but I want him cut off. No more money, no more gambling stakes. If he wants to drink himself to death, that's his choice, but I won't watch it anymore." Jacob nodded slowly. "Done. What's the 3rd condition?" Margaret looked at him, really looked at him. At the man who'd bought her and then offered her freedom. At the man who'd watched her from across town for 3 years and never said a word till he thought he was saving her. "That you give me time," she said quietly. "Time to forgive you. Time to learn who you really are. Time to see if this can be something real instead of something that started with a poker hand." Jacob stood, crossed the room until he was standing in front of her, close enough to touch, but careful not to. "I'll give you all the time in the world, and I'll spend every day of it trying to deserve you." Margaret held out her hand. "Then we have an agreement, Mr. Mercer." He took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "We have an agreement, Miss Thornton." They were married 3 days later in the small church on the edge of Deadwood, with half the town watching and the other half gossiping about what they were watching. Margaret wore her mother's dress, altered to fit. Jacob wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable in the best way possible. And when the Reverend asked if she took this man of her own free will, Margaret looked Jacob in the eye and said, "I do," and meant it. The scandal died down eventually, the way scandals always do when the frontier offers up something newer and more shocking to chew on. Samuel Thornton dried out, found work at the livery, and never gambled again. He and Margaret reached an understanding. Not forgiveness, not quite, but something like peace. Jacob kept his word about everything. Half of his holdings went into Margaret's name. The homestead was sold to a young family from St. Louis. And every day Jacob came home to the house they shared and asked Margaret how her day was, what she needed, what she wanted, like her opinions mattered, like she mattered. It took time, months, a year, But slowly, Margaret found herself looking at her husband differently, noticing the gentleness in his hands when he helped her down from the wagon, the way he listened when she talked about wanting to start a school for the children in Deadwood, the way he'd wake in the night sometimes, reaching for her, afraid she'd disappeared. One evening, 2 years after the poker game that changed everything, Margaret stood on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the Black Hills copper and gold. Jacob came out to stand beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I was thinking," Margaret said slowly, "about the night I walked into your room at Sullivan's. How angry I was. How certain I was that you'd stolen my life." Jacob was quiet, waiting. "I was wrong," she continued. "You didn't steal my life. You gave me a chance at a new one. It just took me a while to see it." Jacob looked at her, surprise and hope flickering across his face. "Does that mean—" Margaret smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded. "It means I've decided to stop waiting for this to feel real. It already does." Jacob set down the coffee cups and pulled her close, and for the first time since the wedding, Margaret leaned into him without reservation, without conditions, without the ghost of that poker game standing between them. The frontier had strange ways of bringing people together, sometimes ugly ways, sometimes desperate ways, but sometimes, just sometimes, those rough beginnings could be polished into something beautiful, given enough time and honesty and stubborn love. And out there in Deadwood, where fortunes turned on luck and lives changed with the flip of a card, Margaret and Jacob Mercer built something that luck alone could never have won. They built a life worth choosing. Thank you for listening to this tale here on Frontier Love Tools. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe, because out here on the frontier, every sunset hides another story waiting to be told.